Good afternoon. Hello. It's my pleasure. I'm Julie Lawson-McDowell, and I'm the Knowledge Management and Research Coordinator with CALP. And the session we're about to have now is a very exciting one because it's member-proposed and member-led. And the topic is humanitarian cash transfers and social protection. What works, what doesn't, and what we need to do next. I think most people here will think this is a fairly important topic, but also one that we're struggling with. There's a lot of work going on at the moment. CALP itself has 3 pieces of work, some in partnership, in this area. And we're all keen to know about practical examples of what does and doesn't work, and different ways forward in different contexts. So I'll hand over to Emily Henderson from DFID, who's going to introduce the panel and the rest of the session.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon. Welcome for the last session of the day. My name is Emily Henderson. I'm a humanitarian advisor in DFID social protection team, and I lead the policy work on linking humanitarian cash and social protection. So I wanted to thank the collaborative cash delivery network of NGOs for inviting me. Linking humanitarian assistance and social protection is definitely a policy priority within DFID Nexus work. But from now on, I will leave my DFID hat and take the moderator's one. It's a disclaimer as well for anything that we discuss. We hope to have a very productive conversation, leave no elephants in the room, get them all in the front. So let's see where we go. This morning we heard that humanitarian cash is challenging our roles, our respective roles. We also heard that we should get out of us as humanitarians, should get out of our humanitarian bubble and embrace the broader landscape out there. And linking humanitarian cash and social protection is definitely part of that, part of looking at other actors that are out there, critical in the way we deliver assistance to people. What we propose is that for the coming 90 minutes, for our goal to be to reflect on how linking humanitarian cash and social protection is challenging our respective roles, the ways we collaborate, and with whom we collaborate. We will be looking at practical examples of what works, what might not work, what the challenges and what the opportunities might be, but looking at roles and collaboration. And we'll start with the perspective from an NGO panel, but we would like to open it to the floor and to you. By the way, does this resonate with you? Do you feel that in the recent increase of discussion, practice on linking humanitarian cash and social protection, do you feel that this has made you rethink your roles in humanitarian assistance? Yes? No? Not at all? A bit? A lot? A tiny bit? Okay, guys, we need to get this room. Oh, I have a yes here. A very strong one. Okay, so let's hope that we get this unearthed during the session. Okay, so this session is brought by the CCD, the Collaborative Cash Delivery Network, a network of 15 NGOs that are collaborating on humanitarian cash to bring efficiencies that deliver impact. And they have set up a working group on social protection to explore what the role of NGOs might be and how they can contribute to that. We have here Caroline Chappell, who is our graphic facilitator. Is that right? And you will be taking notes of our conversations, and this will be disseminated through the CCD. And we also have, thanks to Oxfam collaboration with SP.org, we have SP.org audience, which we welcome, so the live-streamed audience from SP.org. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel. So we have Catherine Tedge, who is Global Director at World Vision International, leading on the humanitarian cash and vouchers-based programming. We have Vlad Jovanovic, who is Cash Transfer Programming Advisor at Mercy Corps, and Larissa Pelham, Social Protection Advisor in the Oxfam Global Humanitarian Team, and Chair of the CCD's Social Protection Working Group. Cool. So we'll start with Catherine, who is going to tell us about work in Indonesia. But I would like to hear from you a bit more about the role of national and local government and authorities and the linkages between social protection and disaster risk management departments. If that's okay. So I will hand over to you. Two things. Or actually, can you? No, I will hold this one.
Thank you very much, Emily. And good afternoon. I'm very excited to see so many people still in the late afternoon. It's a lot of resilience of the audience. All right. I will actually briefly talk about our experience in Indonesia. You know, in 2018, early October, late September, there was a huge earthquake, 7.4 magnitude, that hit Sulawesi, one of the bigger islands in Indonesia. And that actually also, unfortunately, triggered a tsunami wave and liquefaction, where water comes through the soil, flooding the whole area. It had a massive destructive impact, actually. Over 60,000 houses were destroyed. About 2,000 people were killed. The death toll until today is not quite confirmed, but there are official death toll rates. And more than 5,000 people at that time of the disaster were missing. And more than 10,000 people were injured, and over 90,000 people were displaced locally. So it had a dramatic impact. With this in mind, we looked at how can actually any humanitarian responder be really fast, because it was about not only immediate survival, but as you can imagine, with all the livelihoods destroyed, it was a dramatic impact. And you know also, the airport at that time in Sulawesi, in Palu, had challenges and was destroyed. So even immediate survival assistance had to happen through local actors. So called Wahana Visi in Sulawesi that has been implementing development programs for some time. And in the immediate aftermath of this, Wahana Visi actually directly liaised with some local partners of Catholic Relief Services, of the provincial government there. And they came together and looked at what options do we have besides the immediate in-kind survival assistance. Because some people started to establish themselves outside of the directly affected area and started trading or bartering goods that they had and that they could actually save. And so what we saw was very interesting in the timeline, that actually a cash working group was established in Palu very few days after the immediate disaster, and it was basically led by the central provincial office in Sulawesi, so the government took leadership, and actually in partnership with the Sulawesi Civil Registration Office, Wahana Visi worked to help facilitate digital registration of affected population, which was very critical because, as you can imagine, people had lost all their goods, including even documents and paper that would prove that they're citizens in Indonesia, that they are entitled, for example, for certain assistance. So this actually was facilitated through a registration mechanism we use, a technology called Last Mile Mobile Solutions, which is not only a digital technology to help fast registration, but it actually also helps tracking, and it also has an e-voucher transfer capability. Then there was much more in the weeks afterwards. You can see there was much more activity once the immediate survival phase for the first 2 weeks was actually basically facilitated, which really looked at how can we ensure that people that have been affected by this disaster can help rebuild. So there was a Cash for Work project intervention that was done. And at the same time, while registration was happening, different partners tried to reach out, and actually the government of Indonesia, the national government and the provincial government were very active in coming together. The National Disaster Management Office, the Ministry of Social Welfare, they joined together efforts to see how a multi-purpose cash transfer that was enabled and facilitated through the support of OFDA and facilitated by Wahana Visi locally, could be linked strategically to the long-term social protection mechanism called, and I'm sorry, my Bahasa Indonesia is not very good, Family Hope, Keluarga Harapan, which actually has been established for some years and is seen in Indonesia as one of the most effective social protection mechanisms. It's child-sensitive, child-focused. There are some conditions attached to this, including, for example, pre- and postnatal care. So it's actually a conditional transfer mechanism. And as part of this, people realized that if they would link up children that had, for example, been orphaned by this disaster and therefore could not even, prove that they were beneficiaries before of the social protection mechanism, could be re-included into the mechanism, and the mechanism could be restarted very effectively and very fast. So what happened also through this kind of joint or complementary digital beneficiary registration mechanism that basically supported a joint registry or a refill of the existing database was to look at other needs and other particular gaps in the service assistance that was provided by humanitarian actors and by development actors. What we really saw as something very exciting as well is that as part of this whole exercise and over the first 2-3 months after the disaster struck, there were several technical guidances or guidelines released by the government of Indonesia that really looked at cash for work and multipurpose cash as a key element of the government of Indonesia's strategy forward, linking also to social protection mechanism. This was something that obviously has been quite unique, not only in the Indonesia context. And what also was quite interesting is that financial service providers like the Central Bank of Sulawesi were becoming a key actor in channeling the transfers to the affected population and not only the social protection transfers. So there was some convergence. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please. So what we saw, what really worked very well, was that there was strong collaboration led by local actors, in particular local government. Obviously, other entities like the UN, UNOCHA, UNICEF were very, very strong because they had supported the social protection mechanism and the collaboration of humanitarian efforts or the different actors during that time. But what was very, very critical was that this Keluarga Harapan had clearly the openness to dock on or to invite the linkage of the humanitarian voucher cash, multipurpose cash assistance into that mechanism. So the digital technology was one very critical piece. It enabled, obviously, the interoperability, and it enabled also the tracking. What was very challenging, however, was obviously the local last mile, reaching out to the affected population. As you can imagine, still roads were not very quickly rehabilitated. So there again, it was very clear without the representatives of the local provincial office, it would have not been possible to be so effective and fast in setting this up. Therefore, again, what we saw is the role of local actors and the role of local civil society is very, very critical in such a context. Maybe we can go quickly to the next slide. So one of the key lessons learned that I wanted to quickly point out is we know digital registration is very important in order to avoid duplication, in order to enhance transparency, in order to ensure that there is a longer-term plan, and the preparedness part of this is super critical. We know there's many disaster-prone areas in the world. We know there is often areas that are very often affected by conflict and displacement. So the flexibility, even though the readiness of the local actors was not at where it could have been maybe ideally, but it was still sufficient to really boost very quickly a humanitarian intervention to create synergy effects and to create linkages to a longer-term social protection mechanism. So, in short, with the work together with the Central Sulawesi Bank, also actually some key elements of financial inclusion were facilitated because now that people had lost even the document and the proof, many others had never been really included in having a bank account, for example, with that bank or their subsidiaries. And with that intentional engagement with the social protection mechanism, people were enabled to open a bank account very easily, without very much bureaucracy. So we clearly see that there is a very high value in being ready, not only cash ready, but to be social protection, shock proactive ready. And therefore, working together and facilitating and being an enabler with local government entities has proven to be super critical. So the policies, the systems, and the people need to have that mindset, an attitude of readiness and facilitation. Maybe we can go to the last slide. Yeah. What we've also seen then, collaboration is king. And we, as one of the members of the Collaborative Cash Delivery Network, really see that the CCD, which was not existing at that moment in Indonesia, but we have seen it now in other country contexts actually really springing up and enhancing not only the coordination, information sharing, but really the collaboration, that the CCD can offer solutions to these challenges of, fragmented information sharing that's not very, let's say, structured often, or outdated information, as well as, yeah, I would say an enhancement of seeing how we can harness not only the survival and immediate assistance support services that humanitarian actors bring, but really linking them meaningfully to longer-term transition and sustainability through financial assistance. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. So, with Vlad, and you will be talking to us about Iraq. So I definitely can. So while you do that, can you also tell us about engagement with actors that might not be traditional humanitarian actors, and, for example, the World Bank in your case, I think.
Sure.
Okay.
So just to build on what Emily said in the introduction, so I had the fortune to work on the Cash Consortium for Iraq for 2 years, with a lot of you in this room, actually. So it's a bit of a wrinkle in my job that, as a HQ advisor, I've since left Iraq, and I sort of, others do the work, and I stand here and talk about it. So I think because there are so many of you here, so just sort of a thank you to Ollie Westerman, Lottie Douglas, Heidi Karuba from DFID, and Virginia Leap, amongst others, for the leadership that they've kind of continue to provide on this work. So it is actually still ongoing, just so you know, in some respects. So yeah, next. So given that I have 10 minutes to go over a 4-year process, I think I'm going to miss lots and lots of important details, but I think what I'm going to do is go through a timeline first, explain sort of the key factors that helped us get to this point where we could build this linkage, or at least kind of the blueprint for the linkage, and then give you guys some lessons learned. And I think because there's so much to it, I think I'm going to summarize what we actually did, what this actually is, in just a couple of sentences. So what follows is an account of how we got to the point as the NGO community or the humanitarian community to actually build a blueprint through this collaboration with the World Bank and sort of by extension the government of Iraq. So we were able to do, essentially through scale and some sort of pretty long-term statistical analysis, estimate what proportion of our MPCA caseload would be eligible for the federal social safety net, right? And that's kind of the outcome that we were looking at. So this timeline shows, from the perspective of sort of the NGO community, the World Bank, the government of Iraq, and the donor community, the key events which led up to this, right? So, and I think key points here are the ones which show us heading towards convergence, overlap to a certain extent, and scale, especially for us as the NGO community. And this kind of key to this is, again, targeting, I think. And I know it might be odd to highlight the use of proxy means tests and targeting more broadly, but I do so only because it was the linchpin of this process, right? So the way we were able to estimate this overlap, essentially, between our caseloads was by doing an overlap analysis. Because we both use the same proxy mean, not the same proxy means test, but the same methodology of targeting, we were able to determine probabilistically how this would work, you know, in theory and in practice. So it actually begins back in 2014 when the federal government of Iraq adopted its first PMT. Next is the formation of the Cash Consortium in Iraq before the Cash Working Group, and that's kind of key, but I'll get to that in a bit. Next would be the CCI's own development of its first PMT, followed by the government essentially opening registration using its targeting system. And then something kind of like, as the humanitarian community continued to deliver its transfers, something happened on the Iraqi side, obviously against the war against the IS and the collapse in oil prices. So even though registration was opened, expansion of the safety net ceased. The government had no money and had no capacity. It didn't actually exist in about a third of Iraq that was occupied by Islamic State. And in that vacuum, the humanitarian community and kind of that MPCA program continued to grow, right? And that's kind of where we achieve scale, the CCI and the Cash Working Group, right? So key point here will be January 2017, when the Cash Working Group, including UNHCR, which was quite an accomplishment in Iraq, for those of you who've been there, adopted the Cash Consortium's essentially program design, all of its tools, its model, its targeting system, and so forth. So for the first time, in this response, every dollar of MPCA delivered was delivered using the same program, with some sort of normal deviations, I guess. This kind of culminated in this kind of joint multi-stakeholder workshop, which began the technical dialogue between us, the Cash Working Group, and the World Bank. And that process is still ongoing. But just to give you guys a notion of how big the MPCA program was, by 2019, over 1 million people had been served in areas where the government didn't really exist, and this safety net didn't really exist. So it became a makeshift safety net in its own right, essentially. Next slide. So here, just very quickly, the 4 key factors which contributed to this sort of linkage that we had designed. So as I said, first is the formation of a consortium and incorporation of a Cash Working Group as a semi-cluster in the Iraqi humanitarian response plan. And the fact that the formation of the CCI preceded the Cash Working Group was pretty key to that. Iraq was and is a highly decentralized, highly competitive response. And the fact that the CCI can refine its approach, its design, its package of tools and services, without a UN architecture, was kind of key to its success in then pushing its model through the Cash Working Group and the UN, essentially. Right? That's kind of why that series is important. Next, harmonization and targeting. So as I said, highly competitive response, huge in funding terms, but highly harmonized. So everything from the intake survey all the way to the monitoring framework was harmonized across the response, which let us sort of get to this scale and its reach that wouldn't have otherwise been possible, right? So we were essentially serving the same people with the same tools, with the same program, which in a system where deviation, decentralization, overlap, and duplication is the norm. So it was actually quite unique in that respect. Third, donor support and quality of funding. And I think donor support primarily from DFID, actually the UN more broadly, but key to this really is quality of funding. And what I mean by this is sort of size, one, so the actual funding that we received, its continuity, and just its resourcing, right? So we were able to resource research, we were able to resource value for money analyses, all these sort of innovative things that we couldn't have done before. And for those of you who've been in Iraq, you will know what turnover has done to that response, right? So we've been in Iraq, not necessarily 16 years, but 16 times once, right? And it's very difficult to institutionalize something like this, which requires about 4 years of work and dedication and sustained engagement on a conventional humanitarian funding stream, right? So in a 6-month project and a 9-month project, we know how it goes, right? The PM quits, there's an overspend, there's an underspend, and then you get a no cost extension. And it's very difficult to institutionalize something as complex as this with that sort of funding stream. And then finally, the convening power of the World Bank. I think without their weight and their gravitas in this process, we couldn't have engaged with government systems and the government social protection network on this footing, right? So because we engaged with them and had the capacity to do so, we ended up establishing a technical dialogue which protected us from sensitive pressures, right? Because this is a sensitive topic. We're talking about a handover of the humanitarian caseload to the federal Iraqi government in Baghdad. So allowing us to kind of work only with the World Bank was a huge boon, actually. Yeah. Next slide. And finally, some lessons for you guys. So I know I've covered these, but just most of these anyways, but just to reiterate, I think if it weren't for sort of these robust targeting systems and the harmonization that we achieved in that scale, none of this would have been possible. I think the government would have taken notice of us. There wouldn't have been recognition from the donor community about sort of the accomplishments of the MPCA program and sort of the impact it's been able to have. It would have been impossible without, again, the quality and scope of funding that was available to us and continues to a certain extent now in different shape. A multilateral intermediary in the form of the World Bank. on our part, actually, technical capacity to engage with the bank team. One of the first sort of misconceptions, I think I'm good. One of the first misconceptions when we initially began the dialogue was, not misconceptions, actually surprises, was the bank recognized that we had the capacity to talk about proxy means testing and conduct some of this more complex statistical analysis that the humanitarian community doesn't necessarily always do, right? And that was sort of institutionalized within the response, right? So within the CCI management unit, within the cash working group, in the form of advisors, and so forth. And I would say, actually, most importantly, duty of care and due diligence on our parts. So I think we can do everything right. So we can get our targeting systems right, our information management systems right, our program quality can be airtight. If you're engaging with a punitive government partner, the risk of doing harm to the people that you actually refer runs very high. And I think in societies sort of undergoing civil strife, intercommunal violence, this is, the risk of harm is huge, right? So in places in Iraq where we would be referring households, often they will be put in front of a court which could arbitrarily pass judgment on perceived IS affiliation on spurious grounds, right? So that was one of the key risks that we that came up over the course of this process for us. So one thing is sort of engaging with the Iraqi government in Baghdad, which is quite technocratic and sort of talks about all these analyses and stuff, but policy and practice are two quite different things, and it's important to sort of gauge both. And finally, it's not difficult, it's impossible to accomplish this without a mature social protection system. One that is funded and is delivered, sort of, even if with a degree of dysfunction. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
First presentation done on time.
Thank you. So I will hand over the floor to Larissa. And after that, we'll open the floor, so start thinking about what you want to ask or your reactions and the points you want to bring. Larissa, so if you could give us your reflections about the added value of NGOs and where you see the implications in terms of collaborations with others, and especially what it means in terms of ways of working.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Emily. So I'm just going to set a bit of the context for the discussion to really give some sort of points or thinking points for the discussion that's going to follow. I'll be slightly speaking sometimes in support and in contradiction to some of my colleagues speaking earlier. But to set the context a bit in three different ways. Firstly, this is the first time that a group of humanitarian NGOs have teamed up with the social protection organisation, so socialprotection.org, and said we are going to engage in what is happening around humanitarian response and social protection. NGOs as a group are rather late to the game. The World Bank was talking about this over 10 years ago. Donors and Cotton Don as well. And now it's NGOs that are starting to say, actually, what really is our role as we start to look at the linkage points between social protection and humanitarian work. So that's my first context point. Secondly, in order to actually break down what the role is of NGOs and any actor in this work, you've got to think about the specifics of the context. The way you approach this is going to be incredibly different, whether you're talking about a protracted crisis, slow onset, sudden onset emergencies, whether it's displacement, whether it's conflict, and so on. And on top of that, you've got a whole another level of layers of community and civil society engagement, different levels of government response and capacity, different levels of donor engagement and financing as well. So this whole sort of morass of political economy and the type of shock that the social protection systems are expected to respond to, this really is fundamental and needs a lot more breaking down, discussing and researching and so on. And so I'm going to ignore all of that and spend the next sort of few minutes generalizing on this. I should also say last week at the ILO Social Protection Week, there was a session on humanitarian response and social protection in view of the nexus. And out of a panel of nine panelists, there was only one humanitarian speaker, and that was Oxfam there. And it's just significant that actually there's discussions happening on the social protection side, but the humanitarian side isn't necessarily engaging on the social protection side, and vice versa. So this is sort of an attempt to start breaking down that barrier, and it's happening in other fora as well, I should say. So when we're talking about addressing this topic, I think we can see 4 different systems that are at play, sometimes interacting and sometimes not at all with each other. And these are the systems that civil society needs to be aware of and engage with when it's thinking about this topic. Firstly, there is a formal social protection system, an intervention, what exists already on the ground prior to a humanitarian crisis, and what the types of shock that that system is expected to respond to and who engages with that. Secondly, there is a humanitarian response system, both government departments that are delivering humanitarian response, as well as, in really large emergencies, the international humanitarian system led by the cluster system. Thirdly, there is the response that happens very much informally between households and between and within communities as well. And they are the first to respond in any emergency before either government and state support gets there or any international support. And finally, there are the longer-term programs, the development programs, whether government or civil society or NGOs and externally funded or internally financed as well. But these 4 systems are all at play, and these are the things that we've got to consider as NGOs and as a humanitarian system trying to engage with the issue of social protection. So it is this system, aside from the context and aside from the political economy, which I previously mentioned, that a shock responsive system needs to be aware of. So into that, where do civil society organisations fit in? I think there are 5 areas that we can identify where NGOs really have a role to play. And I'm mixing the term NGOs and civil society to some extent, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. Firstly, it's about engaging civil society. Now, we know that preventive action is far better than humanitarian response at saving lives. And if we have those social protection systems in place, they are already acting as a response to ensure people's resilience against shocks. So we need to help civil society engage. We need to be advocating for those systems and demanding increased public expenditure on those systems. And Oxfam recently actually ran a radio program in Kenya where we had an online radio debate with the public to ask them where they thought public expenditure should be placed and what they thought should happen with taxation. And that was a way of galvanizing the society and the community into really understanding how they might interact and start demanding their rights to social protection. So a second way that I think it's critical for NGOs to engage is around piloting. Many social protection systems or interventions in the global south have often been born out of NGO engagement and in NGO small-scale projects. These are often projects that donors are willing to fund because they feel less risk than funding a government, and governments are often less willing to pilot because there's a lot of political risk if they have to take on a pilot program. So NGOs have a real role to play in piloting tools, practices, and interventions that can be tested, failed, learned from, and then eventually taken up by government. As an example, many of you will be familiar with the Philippines 4P program. And there we are piloting an insurance program, an early action insurance program, which will pay out cash transfers in advance of a shock. And that we hope will be then taken up by government. There are numerous other examples of this, but I'll go on. So a third way that NGOs really have a role in engaging is around delivery. In many contexts, we know that governments don't have the capacity or they don't have the resources and so on to actually deliver their social protection programs. And often they do come back and they fall back on NGOs to deliver those, or maybe they're affected by conflict and they don't actually have the reach and can't get out to the communities. So one example of this that many of you will know, and goes back to Kenya again, was around the Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya. When that started up, it was very much, there were NGOs that were really part of the pillars of the foundation of that program. There were NGOs out doing the targeting, doing the accountability mechanism, and that was really critical to the foundation of the program, which was then handed over to government a few years later so that they could take it on. Similarly, in Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net program, the food assistance is still delivered through NGOs as well. So NGOs have a real role to play in delivery. They may not be the ideal, that may not be what we really want to see. We want to see government delivering and funded systems, but there is certainly a need for NGOs. Fourthly, as NGOs, we really have a role in shaping the system. There are systems that are being established around the world, from Sahel to Afghanistan, and we as civil society really need to shape those systems. And I think there are 4 areas in which we need to do this. Firstly, we need to ensure that there is inclusive targeting processes that is geared towards universal support, but ensures that the marginalised, whether that's gender or female-headed households or people in households living with disability, are really included and they're thought about and embedded within the design. Secondly, around accountability. As civil society, we have a duty to ensure that there are an advocate for accountable systems, to ensure that feedback and complaints mechanisms, data protection issues, monitoring systems are all there and properly functioning. And it's our role to ensure that the national system is accountable to the people affected by a crisis and to ensure that we can protect them from harm. So broadly, this is about saying that the humanitarian principles must ultimately have precedence over a social protection system in delivering during a humanitarian crisis. Thirdly, it's about ensuring the participation of civil society and communities in the design of the social protection system, so that they are relevant to them. And finally, it's about recognising the informal system and how that interacts with the formal system, and to ensure that we can utilise it where possible or engage with it and harness it, to ensure that the systems, any formal systems, don't exacerbate conflict within communities, and that we understand the redistributive mechanisms that happen with communities once we deliver social assistance. And finally, there's a role for IO NGOs, which includes many people in this room. And that's about facilitating the global to national relationship. We need to really act as a conduit from the global level down to the national level, to local level, to really help grassroots actors and civil society and local civil society engage and improve their capacity to deliver and respond and engage civil society. We need to find ways to collaborate on this, and the CCD is one example of a group of international NGOs just starting to do this. We recognise that there is a role for us to play, and we're now starting to collaborate, to discuss, to think about what our role can be, to engage in joint opportunities and galvanise our action. So I'm about to stop. There are just several sort of final points to say. Firstly, I've already mentioned it, but the humanitarian principles must remain ultimate in all of this. Shock responsive social protection systems, i.e. government-funded, government-run systems, will have their limits. And under the sort of precedence of impartiality and so on, we need to ensure that those that need assistance get it. And this will be particularly difficult in conflict contexts. Secondly, the solutions need to be locally based. There's not going to be some global framework that will suit this. They will need, the processes and the engagement will need to be embedded in national processes which inherently have a social welfare, inherently engage both social welfare departments and disaster preparedness ministries as well at their core. So this isn't some sort of superimposed external imposition. And thirdly, financing solutions may in the short term not be fully national, but we need to sort of work towards some sort of internationally funded financing system where both humanitarian and social protection actors can both pay into a kind of common pooled fund, potentially, like a multi-donor trust fund, which can actually ensure that there is money there for when shock responsive systems can scale up or can be utilised, and that money can be drawn down upon. And finally, I think our role as NGOs is clear. We need to shape and influence and advocate for and support the systems. And as NGOs, we need to better reflect on how best we can do that and how we can influence the role of others to play their role too. I think actually donors need to better challenge us as NGOs and as an international delivery community to collaborate a lot more with each other and with governments as well, so that we can support them. And finally, I suppose the challenge partly to the Grand Bargain Sub-Working Group on cash and social protection, that is the only forum where NGOs can actually engage in this process of linking humanitarian and social protection assistance. And this forum we really need to see a better role of NGOs in it. We need to ensure that we're a lot more coordinated, and that group, the group as a whole, is actually spearheading the work on this because it's the only collaborative forum that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. Okay, can I get the... Okay, so this is the time to turn to you. So we have heard from the panel their reflections on what worked, what it meant for the role of different actors, their role as NGOs, the engagement with governments, local authorities, the engagement with actors that were not in the past routinely engaged, like the World Bank. We heard from Larissa also reflections on the role of NGOs. I'm going to open the floor to you for questions, but also maybe do you want to offer your reflections on these reflections about the NGO role or on your own role if you are not an NGO? So just opening for now and then can narrow down. Anyone who wants to react? Let's start with Emma here. I will take 3, turn to the panel and then do like that.
Hello, super interesting. Thank you very much. I guess what's in my mind, and it's probably mostly for questions for Iraq and then Larissa, if that's possible, is around that sustainability, particularly where those people who are getting assistance through that mechanism may, I assume that their needs are pretty much ongoing in those protracted conflict settings. And so what's the long-term plans for what you've set up and how to bring any sustainability to that, particularly in Iraq? And then Larissa, I'd be really interested, you know, when you said about NGOs having a role sort of advocating for expansion of welfare programs, essentially, and social safety nets, how do you have any idea from data of how many of those have been taken up and are now being run by governments? Thank you.
Thank you. I will go to Joe and then you. Yeah. Was it?
Hi, I just wanted to say that was really great, and it's just it's wonderful to know that, you know, we're kind of shifting beyond the humanitarian-centric sort of focus and harnessing government social protection systems, because that's the sustainable way forward in terms of these protracted situations. So yes, just congratulations to you all. Thank you.
Thank you for the 3 of you for the wonderful short summaries of very complex programs. So I have a question to see if the 3 of you could reflect a little bit for the case studies you've given. How entitlement might have affected the success or failure. So civil society's own perceptions of what they're entitled to in a social protection program. Somewhere like Iraq, you know, with the oil for food legacy of decades of who's entitled, compared with somewhere maybe like Yemen, where maybe Oxfam was helping the social protection program scale up, compared with the Mercy Corps, the example in Indonesia, where the government and the local authorities have quite a clear role on how they target. So I just wonder if entitlement and civil society's perceptions of what they should be accessing have affected the success.
Thank you. Apology, I didn't ask for you to introduce yourself, so that was Jackie.
Sorry, I'm Jacqueline Fries.
That
That was Jacqueline Fries. Sorry.
I'm Emma Dilo from British Red Cross.
Joe Philpott, consultant.
Great. Okay, so I will start with you, Vlad. If you could tell us your views about the question from Emma on sustainability and what's the long-term plan? As simple as that. Yes, of course, actually.
So, well, sustainability kind of depends on the government counterpart, right? So one of the reasons this stopped, or slowed down at least, was a change in government in Iraq. So where we had previously had a very supportive minister and team around him, that then changed after Haider al-Abadi stepped down and a new cabinet came in. The new minister didn't believe in sort of the approach, the sort of notion of targeting and so forth. And the process kind of broke down. So it's very difficult to refer or jointly administer registration and intake and so forth, and kind of jointly program in essence when there's no support from your counterpart. And the second one I would say is, I touched on this in the presentation, what you experience in the green zone doesn't necessarily, in Baghdad, doesn't really reflect practice. So while we were having these discussions with the World Bank team on the use of the proxy means test and all this sort of overlap analysis, in reality, governors, so provincial governors, had lots of sway over how the safety net transfers were administered. Right, so they could remove names arbitrarily, they could add names arbitrarily. So the process kind of did break down a bit. And where it existed, on paper, it didn't necessarily in practice and so forth. So what we did was important as a blueprint. Executing that might be a bit more difficult. And it would just require very localized engagement on our part. Yeah, that was.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add on that point, or shall I move to the NGO advocacy question? To you, Larissa, if that's okay. Do you want to add first?
I can maybe add to the Indonesian example. As you said, obviously in Indonesia the context was a bit different, right? We had already an existing social protection program, multiple actually, that were working somewhat well. However, what was shown actually is that the inclusion and exclusion challenge also still there prevailed until the MPCA actually helped to refresh, basically, give an update. And there actually, again, the role of civil society, of Wahana VC, helping to feed in new or additional beneficiaries into the social protection. It's a child-sensitive social protection mechanism, right? So this Family Hope program by the government is targeting mothers, older people, as well as obviously young children. And one of the conditions there actually is that you fulfill not only pre- and postnatal care, but also school enrollment and attendance. So 85% school enrollment and attendance is one of the criteria. How much that was enforced is a big question mark. And this is now a follow-up item, even for civil society in Indonesia, for child-focused organizations, to ensure that the success story that the Family Hope program had, facilitated again by the MPCA, which actually more was a trigger, right? Not only a survival mechanism, a trigger to relook at inclusion and exclusion in a new way and using more digital means with a, I think, synergetic outreach by multiple actors. So what we see here is, I do think it was not, I don't think it was a competition, it was not unnecessary, it actually helped to trigger new discussions about policy frameworks on child-sensitive social protection, about the quality of services, and about what I just said before, inclusion-exclusion. So the targeting criteria were very clear, but it was clear that even the practical implementation of those was not very, very effective at some point. So the humanitarian assistance helped to trigger and raise this again into not only a discourse, but into improvement and correction.
Thank you. So Larissa, if you could address the question on NGO, on the role of NGOs in advocacy and success rate.
Great. I'm going to stand up so I can see people at the back. Yes, just a quick point from the Red Cross about where it's been taken up and whether this has been documented. I can talk a lot about Oxfam examples of where it's been taken up, so I could blow my own our own trumpet. I don't know if this has actually been documented, and actually I think it's an interesting point for the CCD to be taking up, because we're actually going to be doing, we are doing a scoping survey of what all our capacity is with social protection across our different organisations. And actually one of the interesting things, based on your point, would actually be very much to say where we all implemented certain projects and where has there been taken up by government on this. I know in Kenya there was an urban cash transfer which Oxfam set up with Concern Worldwide, and that was then adopted by the Nairobi administration, and actually got an award this year for sort of one of the top urban projects or something under the Milan Urban Awards or something. Afraid I should know that. And in Yemen, we're working very much in hand with the government to deliver cash to both Lebanese and vulnerable Lebanese and refugees as well, Syrian refugees as well, that are hit by an additional shock on top of their vulnerable status, or their already current vulnerable status, to deliver additional cash, short-term cash for them to overcome an additional shock. There certainly are cases where this has been taken up by government, but I don't know how well documented that's been. But to come on to the really interesting question on entitlements, yes, I mean, that's a massive advocacy point. That's absolutely what we need to be doing as civil society organisations. As I said sort of right at the start, it's really about ensuring that there are those we are advocating at the same time alongside our humanitarian response and what we're doing to link with social protection there. But underpinning all of that is an ongoing engagement on advocating for funded social protection systems, and that people actually understand what their entitlements and rights are to social protection. And so that's about, yes, so I think that's a critical question, but that's ongoing. That's not beholden on the humanitarian community to do that themselves alone.
Do you want to add? Yes, please.
The entitlement
on
question?
The entitlement.
That's a good one, actually. So I think the biggest issue caused by entitlements in Iraq, I would say is it's obviously quite a Baathist state in its current forms. It has been for a number of decades. So coverage of these social protection systems has typically been universal. And I think that's conditioned quite a lot of perceptions around entitlement. So a lot of the issues that we experienced were around targeting, right? I think a lot of the feedback that we received through our complaints mechanisms tended to be about this perception of exclusion. Because we did use this sort of fairly strict targeting system, we were always very clear about the duration of our transfers. And I think there was an understanding that we are charities in essence, we are NGOs, and what we provide is temporary. That was very clearly communicated. So like, it's more how universality conditioned preferences rather than the duration of funding, because we did communicate very clearly about that.
Do you want to add, Catherine?
The question of sustainability is a general one, not only for cash. I mean, we are grappling with this issue for a long time, and there is for no reason, well, there is a clear reason why we talk about humanitarian development peace nexus and how we strengthen a transition strategy and an exit strategy. We should not forget that even in Western societies, in the UK and in Germany, where I come from, we do have social welfare systems, social assistance, and there are some people that are in a state of vulnerability that is not dramatically changing, and they will continuously be a member or an entity that receives that assistance, right? And the same in any shock-affected context. The question for me, which I really think we should further dive into, is if we're linking people to a longer-term social protection mechanism, how can we still enable their resilience so they can maybe graduate out of that mechanism? And I do think we haven't really understood as civil society actors together with government how to do that better. One example is the linkage to financial inclusion. If people are linked to opening a bank account, what are the next service offerings they have? What activities do we undertake, not only from a livelihoods perspective, but working with private sector and in particular local private sector to enable that financial household level economic resilience, and other actors can step in as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Next round of questions. Here, did you have one or? Well, I don't want to put you on this, but I think.
Virginia Leap from CCI, and it's building a bit on, Catherine, what you were just talking about, but I had a question about social protection versus productivity, because I think there is obviously space for both, but as cash actors, how should we weigh up the exit strategies of passing on a vulnerable household into a national social protection program versus trying to increase the productivity of the household so it becomes self-reliant and no longer dependent on cash transfers?
My question, you guys started to address it, so I just kind of wanted to pick your brains a little bit further about it. Because in my experience, targeting is super challenging, right? Like the inclusion, exclusion, and Catherine, you started to talk about that. So I was just hoping if you could talk about that a little bit more. You mentioned, Vlad, what did you say? It was sort of amazing. It was about linking up with a system that has a degree of dysfunction. So I'm thinking, like, as NGOs, what is our role, especially if we're not there for very long? Like, what kinds of things can we be doing to be, in a real way, improving those systems? I mean, at a very basic level, if we have a different list than a government list, that's an immediate challenge that we might need, like World Bank intervention or somebody else to kind of help facilitate. So just a little bit more on your experience in that. Oh, I'm Dina Brick with CRS.
Hi, I'm Sarah from WFP, and I was very interested actually in the presentation on Iraq. I think there were a lot of great learnings that came from that. But my question, in considering the theme for Cash Week is collaborating for quality today and tomorrow, as an organization that supports literally millions of people under social protection systems, not on a daily basis perhaps, but maybe on a monthly basis, how do you see the role of the UN in all these discussions that you're having? Because I haven't heard the UN mentioned in any of your presentations.
Thank you. Here we go. Okay, so let's start with the productivity question. Who wants to give it a go?
Yeah, I think I will try. That's an interesting question. I think one thing I would say is, as humanitarian actors, our role has to stop somewhere. And we what we want to ensure is that there is social protection available for everybody when they need to access it. And that to me is a fundamental. That's not that it's a nice to have at some point. That's what's absolutely needed. So there's something for people to fall back on. In addition, is there a need for employment and labour opportunities and so on? Absolutely. And that is part of a sort of social protection response. So that's critical too. It's not an either or. It's absolutely very much the two aspects of it. Whether it's for NGOs always to do the kind of building up the long-term resilience of households as well, at some point there is a need for government to take on some of that work also. But I don't think that it is an either or. It's absolutely the combination of the two. You need a sort of a comprehensive approach to social protection that includes assistance, that includes access to social insurance, that includes labour opportunities, and that includes looking at some of the informal sector as well.
Does anyone of you want to add on the productivity question?
No.
No? Okay, so there was a question on the technical linkages, right? And how to link with a degree of dysfunctionality and with a mention to targeting. So do you want to respond to that?
So it was how can we, through our engagement, improve targeting sort of associated systems within governments, yeah? So I think I'll begin by saying what we can't do. So I don't think we can change sort of their targeting systems. It's a central government, it has its own methods. They won't honestly, they won't take us seriously. One of the first issues at the beginning was, I think, an outsized sense of self on our part and a real misconception on the government side about the scale at which we were working. So I think there's this kind of mismatch of perceived size on both our parts, and I think they won't engage with us on issues like the PMT. They have counterparts like the World Bank, which are sort of institutional and decade-long engagements and partnerships. I think where our impact would lie, especially within the Iraq case study, under ideal conditions, we would have been able to actually administer these surveys jointly, and we would have been able to inform the expansion of the SSN transfers. Right, so we could have informed government capital allocations, honestly, by district even, by district offices, if we had taken this as far as it could go. We could also, just building on what Catherine said, have addressed a lot of the exclusion issues, right? So the government, our enumerators are much more mobile than the government social workers. Our coverage can be much more rapid, often much more expansive, because we can canvass communities in the matter of a week. And I think a lot of these exclusion issues, just because of limited resources, not even necessarily because of poor targeting, would have been addressed if we could do that together. I think that's kind of where that lies. Yeah, that's kind of it for now.
I thought maybe I need to take the question from WFP.
Please go ahead. So on the role of the UN.
Thank you. So I think it's a very critical question because we know WFP, UNICEF, UNHCR, and some of the other colleagues, FAO, are facilitating shock responsive or similar to what we do, humanitarian development linked social safety nets and social protection mechanisms in collaboration with the governments. And I do think that is very well acknowledged, and we know this is actually a very critical role that other actors cannot fulfill. I mentioned UNICEF, which was a key collaborator in the Indonesia Sulawesi case, just because it's child-sensitive social protection. The funding also came from the World Bank for that Family Hope program, or still comes from the World Bank. So we do see there is the need for key global actors to facilitate work with governments. What we see in many contexts is that the UN has, either together with the World Bank or the government, a key convener role, which is very critical. And I do think the systems for scale, there is very, very little doubt, as we saw, for example, in Lebanon, that scaling up quickly and reaching masses of displaced or refugee vulnerable communities, and then rolling out a mass kind of transfer system that links also to government policies, you need key actors that are usually from the UN or from global actors. But when we're looking at what is the complementary role of civil society, I do think we go back to grassroots vulnerability identification and really a live picture from what does it look like, how and why are people excluded at the field. When we go to the accountability aspect of things, World Vision uses, for example, a tool we call Citizen Voice in Action, which is a social accountability tool we've been successfully implementing in development contexts. We're now using this more in fragile context, and what we see, it is working with communities to be empowered to speak to duty bearers and say, wow, you have a policy document here, but here for me, in my little village far away from the capital, I've never seen someone coming out and explaining to me why some people receive this benefit from the government and others don't. So I do think there's a critical role in terms of social accountability, in terms of system strengthening, that grassroots field level organizations, NGOs, INGOs can still very much play and complement what the bigger systems and mechanisms try to actually achieve as well. Scope and quality for impact and transitioning into more self-sustainable processes for communities that are frequently affected by shocks. I do think there is a role for every player, but we need to harmonize, and the data interoperability that actually the CCD works on, and tomorrow I would invite you to come to a session where they will actually showcase the online collaboration tool, is a good opportunity to see which other stakeholders can feed into an information management and coordination mechanism that actually will transcend different actors and different contexts and phases of what community is affected by. Community does not distinguish between a humanitarian disaster or another shock they have in their regular stable lives. They don't distinguish between humanitarian and development actors. So I do think it's a bit of a nexus mysteria we talk about, and for community members, you know, it's just their daily life, for us as well. So we need to tackle it maybe from a more pragmatic perspective.
Any addition to that?
Yeah.
Please
okay.
go ahead.
No, just trying to think this one through. So I would say, so disagree please, I would say that the UN system experiences as much fragmentation and sort of overlap as the INGO community, right? Fragmented systems, overlapping, fragmented mandates, different populations, sometimes the same ones, and so forth. So I think the issues are quite common to us both. I think even where you guys don't account for the majority of the caseload and kind of have that scale and scope, I would say that convening power is a huge a huge positive to contribute to this process. So we, as the CCI, as a consortium of agencies, of INGO, sorry, probably wouldn't have been able to engage with the government on this footing or with the World Bank. So we had kind of that multilateral UN architecture behind us as sort of as an umbrella that allowed us to take this process forward. So I'd say that maybe a recognition that that is also a huge positive, even where perhaps the UN doesn't account for the majority of the caseload. I know that's a partial answer, but that's the one that comes to mind from Iraq.
Thank you. So I would like to open the floor again, but also hear your own views about, I mean, we heard this question, a question from you this morning, a question from you, Karen, about, you know, do we all have a role here? Should we all still be here and continue being here? So, and we are hearing from you, in a way, yes, we all have a role. So do you agree with that? Do we all have a role? Do we have the same roles than we have today? What is changing, basically? And also, what does engagement with governments change in the way we work and what we do? I would like to hear from you, your responses, or if you want to react to what the panel just said. I know it's late in the day. Yes, please go ahead.
So I'm Julie from KELP. What I want to say is on the development side of social protection, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, I think we've seen very good collaboration between NGOs, UN agencies in terms of technical support to governments, in terms of piloting, and working with government to hand over ownership. And what I found almost most interesting in the examples you presented were the ways you were coordinating between development and humanitarian actors. And to me, that seems to be the frontier that we haven't quite managed to address. We have a lot of examples, or we have several important examples from different parts of the world, but we don't have, and everybody's going to go, oh my God, not another formal structure. But we need some sort of formal bridging structure to help us work between the development and humanitarian context in many places. And I think ultimately we'll get there and we'll have some sort of funding that matches that structure. But we're still some way away from that. So I'd love to hear about more examples of successful bridging of coordinating structures between the development, social protection side, the humanitarian and the preparedness, which of course is critical for successful response.
Sure. Any other reaction, comment? Yes, please. Response to that?
Hi, Martin Pittman from CALP. Since you've sort of invited us, I do have a bit of a devil's advocate question. With the caveat that my career started in development, moved to social protection, is now as in humanitarian response, and sort of looking back the other way and building on some of the conversations of this morning and the future of financial assistance and all of that, and how can we do all of that better, are we risking distracting ourselves from all of the improvements that are necessary within humanitarian response by moving further into the challenges of social protection, right? Which are very context specific, very related to functioning of government and things along those lines. So how much are we putting ourselves and our current efforts to improve our work within humanitarian response at risk by moving into social protection as well, despite the logic of all that?
Thank you very much. Any more points? We'll start here.
Thanks, Emily. Vlad, you mentioned that it was difficult to accomplish what you did in Iraq without a mature social protection system, and I think that was the example from Indonesia as well, would match that, and that's probably the first thing that we often think of where there is actually a functioning social safety net to link up with. And I guess with this group here as well, I think it's also a question we're asking around contexts where there isn't a functioning social safety net. What lessons can we learn from social protection cash transfers that can be applied in the humanitarian context, and how can we improve our own humanitarian approaches? So, what's the difference or similarity, I guess, between good humanitarian cash and good social protection programs or good cash transfers?
Your name?
My name is Heidi. I work at DFID.
Good.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth from the IRC. Really nice to see the coordinated effort. I say that as a CCD member, but great to see the coordination happening towards this goal. I'd love to hear more, Larissa, about your call for some sort of common fund that NGOs and multilaterals could pay into, and how that might practically work, and how far are we towards something like that being feasible?
Okay, we have a lot to chew right now. So the first one is around how do we make a much more structural coordination and a bridge between these two potential worlds, humanitarian and social protection. Who wants to give a go at it? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So I would actually challenge that and say I don't think we do want another structure. I think we need to see those systems really locally, nationally based. That's where this needs to start. I don't think it's about some superimposed international structure that tells everybody what to do. I think it's where you start to see collaboration between social welfare ministries and disaster response or disaster preparedness ministries. That's where it's got to start, and that's where we'll start to see things generated. And then you'll have a lot more sort of foundation, ability for civil society to engage. It'll be really sort of based on the grassroots level. If it's some international superstructure, I think it's probably destined to failure. And I sort of slightly hang my head in just horror as to what that might entail. But who knows, maybe that will come about.
Just a quick one. I do think we've seen, as you were just alluding to, actually, in Southern Africa, for example, we know there's a combined engagement between the cash working group and the social protection working group. So we do see it takes the mindset of actors to see that there are overlaps. There may be areas and spheres that are completely different, and that's okay. But there is a lot of opportunity to create synergy effects, even by sharing the approaches, sharing and doing mapping, as the Grand Bargain Workstream sub-working group also is already doing. But we do see there is still a bit of a disconnect from the policy level or the big level, high-level policy discussions and what happens on the ground. I think maybe you wanted to highlight a bit what we've experienced in Mozambique. Mozambique had a social protection mechanism, right? And even there were a lot of action plans. I read yesterday research that talked about what we will do in 2019, said the government of Mozambique. And then we know what happened in Idai, right? With the cyclone response. There were some challenges. I do believe that it requires multiple actors to come together at local level. You may need an actor that triggers that pulls people together from different backgrounds and works closely with the government. Because in the end, if something is not owned by the national government and facilitated, how weak that government may be. Social protection is happening in Somalia. So as you can imagine, it is a reality that requires just multiple actors to really channel efforts and be clear who is doing what, who is adding value what. And I think this is the big question we have in the room. It is, how are we all adding value and not duplicating? How do we consolidate our forces and our evidence and our scope and our coverage so we really do the best for the people that are affected and should be at the center?
Thank you. So I think we have a fundamental question here that you were asking. That is, are we not, at the end of the day, risking to divert, our attention on better humanitarian cash with this now opening to another imperfect world of social protection? So basically, why should we bother?
So I think this comes down to that we need to be we need to delineate between shock responsive social protection systems, which are based within government, that are set up through government social protection systems as part of their sort of social protection floor in social protection parlance, as one of the basic mechanisms of social protection assistance. That needs to happen within government. That's not a humanitarian role. That needs to be based within government. Where humanitarians come in is how we might start linking, when there is some sort of shock, how we might start linking into that. Are there opportunities to support, to help build, to partner with, so that we are not then just generating a whole new entire system of humanitarian response? So to give you an example, in Yemen back in 2012, donors said there was no opportunity to do cash. There was no functioning system through which you could really deliver cash. And they were saying no to any humanitarian cash. Oxfam looked at the system and it said, hold on, there's a postal system that is operating throughout the country. There is also a social welfare list from the previous governments, or the governments that was just about functioning social welfare system. We can take both those systems, and through the national postal system, we're still able to deliver cash. We can look at the welfare list, and we can use those as a basis of doing our targeting, rather than going out and targeting afresh. Now, that looked impossible. I mean, in a context like Yemen, it can't get much harder. But there are often some elements of an existing system that you can use, rather than just going in and saying, right, we're going to find new financial service providers, we're going to set up a new delivery system, we're going to go out and deliver by hand, or set up a mobile payment system, or whatever it is. But there are often elements that already exist. That doesn't mean that you're tapping into parts of a social protection system. It doesn't mean that you have to, it's even particularly complicated necessarily to do. Yes, it has to be government buy-in and so on, but you can often utilize what parts there are already. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily about overloading humanitarian response.
And maybe Catherine and Vlad, if you could tell us, why actually did you decide to work with, the national system? Could you have done better humanitarian cash without engaging with an existing system? What did it change in the quality of response, in the result for people? Was it worth it? So the question is, did we divert some of the attention from doing better cash to link with social protection? Was it worth it? Did it bring any benefit? Did it change anything in the quality of response? Or in something else?
Had we just went at it alone?
Traditional or better humanitarian cash. Put all your energy on that.
Yeah, I'd say, honestly, if funding were sort of indefinitely available, then I would say yes. But I think the reality of it is, that it's not. I do think this is a responsible way out, and in a situation where our remaining there as a safety net in our own right, as a parallel one at that, probably isn't the wisest thing to do, at the very least. So I would say, had we had sort of a more supportive partner, we probably would have kept going, and I think that is probably the right thing to do. If the conditions were right, obviously, you know, with everything I said. So no, I wouldn't necessarily say that we should stay there. Was our programming better? Yeah, I would say that, to be honest. Just because it is, in vast parts of the country, Iraq is a failed state. I don't say that lightly. The government doesn't really exist, but in a warped form in some of these rural areas, and it can be very punitive in some of these more rural areas affected by the IS insurgency, right? So I think in that respect, we definitely were better prepared, but in the long run, if the conditions that I kind of discussed here were in place, then we would have been successful.
Catherine, do you want to add?
I do think definitely in the Indonesia case, it was very worth it. It helped actually to really put the local government again into the driver's seat, even I do think for humanitarian assistance in the future. The establishment of a cash working group that was co-led by the provincial government was very, very critical to showcase that humanitarian actors can piggyback or can use existing mechanisms, but they can also do this to improve and fill the gaps and cover the gaps. So I do believe that without having done MPCA just completely separate, it would have just created another structure and another engagement coordination mechanism. It would not have been cost efficient, very sure. And it has actually opened up the mindset of everyone. There are gaps that we need to look at in a long-term social protection mechanism. So definitely a yes. It is really very contextually dependent, right? So we need to be very clear. And that's why different actors need to come together and have joint mapping and need to talk to each other. If we do not do this, I do think we all fail. Whether one organization or actor is mandated in this way or the other way, still there is a need for enhanced interaction and coordination. Otherwise, we're failing the people we're supposed to serve.
Thank you. We have a question about contexts where there might not be social protection system to link to, or no mature system or no government able to collaborate. What learning can you take from linkages with social protection to contexts where there are no social protection systems? One of you, if one of you wants to talk about a context where you might not have had a social protection system to link to, but you have migrated some learning. Does that exist, or is the limit basically there needs to be a social protection system, full stop?
I mean, I think the first answer to that is that in every country in the world, there is some sort of social protection system that exists. It might not be universal, it might not be reaching very many people, it might be very sporadic and not well run. There is something there. Now, whether you can utilize any part of that is a different question, but there is always something there. I mean, going back to that example of Yemen, you couldn't get much more of a broken state than Yemen, and yet you could still find something functioning. I mean, we all kind of always hear stories about how civil servants, they turn up for work even when they're not being paid. You know, people are quite, systems can be quite robust. And I think particularly in kind of fragile and conflict-affected states, you can often find remnants of something that you can actually start utilizing, and that in itself has a long-term positive impact of actually helping those systems to go on functioning.
Thank you. And the last one, now that we don't have many minutes left, so there was a question about for you to expand on the common fund.
Yes.
So if you could tell us more,
so I
but
should
shortly.
say this is part of one of the research questions that Oxfam has under its new humanitarian social protection strategy, which we're just launching at the moment, actually. So clearly we need some sort of sustainable financing mechanism. Ultimately, where we want all this to go is that you're going to have nationally funded programs so that are able to deal with both citizens and refugees and stateless and so on within a geographic context. But you are still going to need international funding. And you need some sort, given that one of the biggest difficulties about this linkage between humanitarian response and social protection is the issue around development and finance and humanitarian funding streams. You need some sort of pot that both humanitarian donors and development donors can put funding into. So therefore, some sort of multi-donor trust fund might be one opportunity. And what that could look like, and I'm saying this without Oxfam having done its research on this, and it's something we want to develop, is could there not be some sort of system that is part of a more comprehensive social protection financing or financing fund social protection fund, more universal social protection fund, but there's one element that's looking particularly at social protection in crises that could be then financed and then drawn down upon by states when there is some kind of shock. Now that would be predicated on the fact there is some sort of functioning sort of safety net of some sort that's there. That would be a prerequisite, but that some sort of system that countries could draw down upon. The financing is already there. You don't have to go to the whole go through all the appeals process and so on. You could draw down on that funding and get and then able to sort of scale up your shock responsive social assistance program.
I'm sure we could do a whole session about funding across.
If anybody wants to fund that research, yeah, I'd be happy to talk to them afterwards.
Okay, I would like to have a speed challenge. So I would like to hear from you guys. We are going to go on to menti.com. So telephones. We have 10 minutes to do this, right? So telephones, internet, the code. So if you go on menti.com and use the code that is here, do you all have Wi-Fi? So the Wi-Fi is ETC venues, okay? And the code, can I write it somewhere? Or can you write it on the slide? Is Wi-Fi 8129. Can you write this here?
Because this isn't the slide.
It is in the slide.
So it's, does anyone not have the Wi-Fi codes already on their phone?
Do as you want. Technologically, choose your provider. Freedom of. So, and if you can tell us what is your main takeaway, the main idea, the main point that you heard. There's one on the nice drawings, Caroline. Okay. More or less everyone has managed? Great. So I'm not going to recap everything that we discussed, but I think we did hear that there are more actors involved, that it's a lot about collaboration. We heard some models of collaboration. We also heard that there was not a one-size-fits-all, from what I have heard, and a strong role of the context. There were a number of questions about the trade-off between doing better humanitarian cash, investing in longer-term systems, engaging with governments, versus access, quality. We now have a number of points here. And basically a reflection on what it means for our own individual roles. I'm going to invite you for one sentence, like a parting sentence, one, right? And then I will thank you all. Who wants to start? It has to be in the flow. Who wants to start? I'll start. Yeah.
Good.
So my one sentence is, local actors' leadership can only be enhanced through engagement and really meaningful engagement. Because if we want to create resilience and if we want to make sure that very few people need actually continuous social protection, you need to create resilience. And that cannot be done by one single actor. So local actors in collaboration. That was more than one sentence.
In approximately one sentence, I would say we really need to, at the international level, we really need to engage with the Grand Bargain Sub-Working Group on social protection and humanitarian cash, because that is the only opportunity where we can get all actors in the room. NGOs have been quite excluded from the system so far, or from the processes, or we haven't engaged very much. And this is our opportunity to really show what role we have to play in order that civil society engages and we ensure that actually the support gets to the households who need it.
I didn't actually prepare this one. I'd say, for the NGO community in particular, I think we need to learn how to work in unison, even where it is slightly more challenging than not, and recognize the benefits of that to our programming and ultimately the assistance that we deliver. I know it's quite vague, but...
Thank you. Thank you. The conversation doesn't stop here, obviously, and I will re-put 3 seconds my DFID hat to say, yes, let's take the conversation to the Grand Bargain subgroup and any other relevant forum. Great. Thank you very much for kind of being here, even at the late time of the day. I want to thank the CCD for bringing this session. Thank Caroline, who has been doing an amazing job, and we will be able to see your work on the CCD platform. I want to thank sp.org that is looking at us, and you, the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for that panel and really engaging Q&A. And yes, thank you especially also to Caroline. This is the coolest thing. I love it. So that's the end of today. For those of you who are coming tomorrow, registration and coffee starts at 8:30. Session kicks off at 9. Looking forward to seeing you then. For those of you who came just for today or just for this afternoon, thank you ever so much for coming. If you have any feedback, you can come and let me know. We are now also going for very informal drinks, if you would like to join us at the Ship Inn. It's a 17th century public house on Talbot Street, I think. Talbot Street? Yeah. So if you would like to join us, you're most welcome. And that wraps up today. Thank you very much, everyone.